I'm Jennifer Sness. You're watching News 24 Live. International best-selling author Sarah Waters is joining me in studio. And today we're going to be chatting about her 6th book, The Paying Guests. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for coming in. I know you have a short time in Cape Town, so it's such an honor to have you in our studio.
Thank you.
Now, hearing international best-selling author before your name, what does that make you feel like?
Oh, it's exciting. I mean, you know, every author, I don't think any author starts off their career expecting that, you know, they're going to find that kind of readership. So it's wonderful. It's wonderful. My career is built very, very slowly over the years, very gradually, I mean. So I find myself in the very luxurious position of just being able to write the kind of books I want to write and finding readers for them. It's lovely.
Now, The Paying Guests is set in 1922. Why don't you start off by setting the scene for anyone who hasn't picked up the book yet?
Yes, it's set in London in 1922 in a bit of suburban South London called Camberwell, and most of it takes place in a home belonging to Frances Ray, a youngish spinster, and her mother. They're middle class, but they've run out of money, so they've had to bring in lodgers, the paying guests of the title, Leonard and Lillian Barber, and they are a sort of lower middle class couple. And the novel is about the kind of entangling of their lives and the rather dramatic consequences that leads to.
Now, it was inspired by a real court case that happened in the 1920s. When did you pick this case up? Tell us about the first time you heard about it and what clicked for you.
Yeah, it was very loosely inspired by this case involving a woman called Edith Thompson. She was an unhappily married woman having an affair with a much younger man, Frederick Bywaters. And she wrote him many passionate letters over the course of several months. He finally killed her husband, but he was arrested and she was also arrested, and the police found the letters and put her on trial under a charge of incitement, and they were both found guilty. And even though she'd played no part in the murder, she was hanged for the murder alongside Freddie. And it was a case that really gripped the UK at the time, because I think it was sensational, but also it pressed so many buttons about things that were changing in society, class relations and women's lives, you know, women getting more freedom, more sexual freedom. So it's a fascinating case in its own right, but I was very struck by, you know, the idea of this murder happening, not a murder that involves psychopaths or kind of, you know, criminal masterminds. It's just a very ordinary scenario where somebody makes a terrible mistake and people's lives are sort of plunged into chaos and nightmare as a result. It's also, of course, a very heterosexual story. And what I began to think was, you know, what would this have been like if the affair, the love affair, had actually been a lesbian one rather than a heterosexual one? And that's when the story began to come alive for me.
Now, tell us about the time period. Did you know much about it before you started writing?
I didn't know, which for me was one of the motivations of beginning the book, because I often, with a period, I'll know a little bit about it or quite a lot about it, and that's what produces my interest in the period. But with this, I've written sort of to either side of the 20s. You know, I've written novels set in the 19th century, I've written novels set in the 40s, and I didn't know much about the 20s, and that was why I went there, really. I wanted to explore it and figure out what made it tick, figure out what its typical stories might have been. And it was in doing my research that I began to find the details that kind of coalesced then to produce this novel.
Was it hard to find the tone? I mean, and the slang. I mean, if I was researching, I don't know if I would be able to write as believable as you do. How hard was that?
Well, it's always one of the challenges of writing historical fiction. I mean, this is written in the third person, but nevertheless, I wanted the tone of the novel to feel like it belonged to Frances, the main character in particular, but also just to that period, to that moment in history. So I read lots of novels from the period, I read newspapers from the period, I read diaries and letters, which are in some ways the most useful because they're a slightly more immediate way into people, the way people talk. Yeah, I just had to kind of build it up bit by bit, and to try and create the illusion ultimately with historical fiction. You want your audience to believe, you know, that you're transporting them to another era, and it's a technical challenge.
Now I want to talk about the characters, some dramatic events happening in this book, a lot of twists and turns and a lot of emotions. What was it like for you as the writer? Did you feel for the character?
I did. You always have to, of course, when you're writing a novel. You have to enter into your characters' predicaments You have to be able to identify with them, even if they're unpleasant characters. You have to find those points of identification. And in this novel, my two main characters, Frances and Lillian, you know, I came to like very much, and they do go through a dreadful ordeal. Really, I only laugh because I often put my characters through through awful ordeals, and it seems an awful thing to do. But from a narrative point of view, there's nothing more exciting really than taking your characters on a tumultuous emotional journey. But yeah, you do have to enter into that, and it was quite an emotional book to write this in all sorts of ways, because I believe in their love. You know, it's not just a casual fling that they have. It's a proper true love, but it's tested by this terrible thing that happens and the ordeal that they go through afterwards. So I wanted, hopefully, my reader to believe in it and to care for them as well. So I really had to bring the emotions really to the surface.
And you often hear authors speaking about that one character that drives the book and that is in their mind, almost telling them where the story is going to go next. Is there one character that did that for you in this novel?
Well, I felt particularly fond of Frances, who's the main character. You know, she's a spinster daughter at a time when it was terrible to be a spinster in the 1920s. It was the lowest form of life, really. I mean, ironically, Lillian, who's a lower middle class woman, obviously has less kind of status than Frances, but yet as a married woman, she has more. And I was very interested in those sort of nuances of who had what kind of power, you know, who had what kind of status. But I felt very comfortable with Frances. She's quite a spiky character. She's a very brave character in lots of ways, but then she also crumbles a bit when she's put under, you know, intolerable pressure. And I both admired her bravery and understood her weaknesses, and I think that's crucial when you're creating a character as well, that you can enter into their flaws as well as their strengths. You have to be able to do that.